know it's crazy, but it's
You're watching Channel Z, the world's leading zombie apocalypse channel. Broadcasting live from Studio Z.
makes me act the way I do.
Hello.
Hello. Welcome to Zombie History, everyone, where we explore the buried past. I hope you're ready to unearth some history with us today. Hi, I'm your host, Dr. Mzilikazi Koné. My co-host, Liz Grumbach, is joining me today. Hi, Liz.
Hi, Mzilikazi. How are you today?
I'm excited to be here. I'm very excited to be here, everyone.
Same. I think I'm still experiencing the apocalypse, but I'm really excited to be launching this new show in the apocalypse.
Yeah, It's nice to have something to look forward to, even in these times.
Absolutely agreed. So before we get started, Dr. Koné, I was wondering if you would want to chat with me a little bit about what zombie history is, what the show is.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, zombie history is a place for us to unpack history, as it were. The thing is often one history is told and we can be zombified by that history. We can be wrapped up in its ability to have a hold on our collective thoughts and our collective story. Our zombified history is held up as the truth, as the story. Though, of course, historians and those who engage with history are very much aware of the hidden histories that never quite make the cut as the story that should be shared broadly. So, as the truths that are taught to us through all of our shared experiences of socialization and schooling, often really ought to take them as face value. But what happens with these zombie histories when we just dig into them just a little bit? Well, we uncover other histories that add more complete truths and enrich our collective stories. That there are many histories and that there are many truths that need to be told. And here's a space for us to unpack those and discuss them. Okay. Their histories and stories, they are grounded and root our collective experiences. And by making them more broad, we get a more complete sense of our histories. So, yeah.
That's absolutely amazing. I hated to interrupt you, but I was going to say that I absolutely love this, that there's these kind of linear, non-linear forces happening in history. So there are histories that get forgotten because there are stories that we tell over and over again, and that the stories that we tell over and over again are influenced by these existing narratives or structures or oppressive forces. And I wonder if that's right.
That is right. I mean, when we think about and often hear the statement about who's written the histories that we share as the history, right? Or that saying about history being told by the so-called winners, right? So there are existing stories and histories. It's just a matter of unearthing them, right? Unpacking them and discussing them and sharing them as valid and central parts to this story. So as for example, we are here discussing zombies. And often when we talk about zombies in the culture, we rarely root the story and the mythology and the experience of the zombie as connected to the experience of the slave trade, of the transatlantic slave trade, as rooted in stories and histories around colonialism and slavery, right? Even the story that unites us here to discuss zombies has its roots in the African diaspora. And those are some of the stories and histories that we seek to unpack today. Yes.
Thank you so much, Mzilikazi. I wonder if you would chat a little bit about the African diaspora and diaspora in general, and how I think that's a really important term that we're rooting the show in.
Absolutely. So when we think about the African diaspora, we're thinking about all the people who are connected to Africa, right? And rooted to it as a homeland. So those born and raised throughout the continent, and all of those who are connected to the African diaspora who are across the world, most often scattered around the world through these processes of colonization and the transatlantic slave trade and migrations. And so when we talk about the African diaspora, we're talking about the people all across the world who are connected to Africa, either right now or through generations past, but that are rooted in the African and Black experience in the New World, the so-called New World, but really the world over, right? So that is the African diaspora for which we will be rooting our discussions, our histories, and stories.
Thank you so much. I think I'm just vibrating with excitement about this show in general, right? Because one of the reasons that I think that we were inspired to work together is that there are these histories that are not told. There are these zombifying forces in history in general, right?
That's right.
So thinking through the ways in which history is zombified by the systems that the discipline of history is in, is one thing that we can do. But then I think that one of the other things we were interested in is telling these stories of resistance.
That's right.
And healing. And I wonder if you would talk about that a little bit, about how resistance is so important when we think about the ways in which histories have been zombified.
Oh, that's a great question. Well, resistance is central to the story, because so often when we talk about those who've been made into zombies, or those who've had the effect of zombification, it's always kind of discussed as like, that happened and that's the end of the story. Like, you've been made into a zombie and that's it for you, right? Rather than unpacking the spaces, even through zombification, whether we're thinking about that physically or mentally, that there are still spaces that people resist the process of zombification, right? That they resist it through practice, through storytelling, through a myriad of ways of actually kind of countering a response to zombification. And that's central to this show today, but central to the whole show is, where can we unpack and unearth really these spaces, these stories of resistance around zombification.
And I love that, because these stories of resistance have always existed.
That's
and
right.
It's just that maybe they are only told in some spaces, and having them told in this space that we're creating for zombie history feels so vital to the mission of the apocalypse, maybe.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, because within those stories, there are lessons for us. There are lessons for us all to be had when we expand the telling of histories, and when we discuss resistance, because perhaps there are moments in our apocalyptic world of today where we can use those stories of resistance, use them to our own defenses, right? And help us to think in this current moment of spaces to resist the forces of zombification. And that's something that unpacking these stories are really going to help us to do, right? Not only as we see the threat of resistance in the past, but how do we use those threads right here and now?
Thank you so much. I, again, am really excited. I feel like it's an honor to be here talking with you. I know originally we first had a really amazing conversation on another show on Channel Z, Brain Dead Theater, where we were talking about, race and zombies in movies, right?
Right.
And to continue that, to look at kind of zombies throughout history, not just the history of film, but forces of zombification throughout history, the what zombies have been, and what those forces are. It just seems exciting. So thank you for being here with me.
Oh, I'm so excited to be here. What an awesome show that we've got ready for you all.
Yeah. So I wonder, maybe it's time to transition into the episode itself. So Mzilikazi, what undead stories are we focusing on today?
Well, we're really going to root the show in the stories, rooting the stories in the experience through the African continent, right? We really want to start by thinking through zombification from that perspective, and to be thinking through spaces for resistance as well. So we want to kind of get into thinking through slavery and colonization, and African spiritualities and practices as a form of resistance to zombification, but really to understand and unpack these rooted in the African continent primarily, rather than focus on the start in the kind of American encounter, right? The tools through which the people were able to have with them, bring with them through the transatlantic slave trade as tools, as seeds of resistance to be explored and expressed in the Americas. But really, when we think about this discussion of the transatlantic slave trade and slavery in general, we are only highlighting one side of colonization, right? The other side is colonization as we explore it on the continent of Africa, right? So they are really two sides of the same coin, and we would be remiss to not start our conversation as rooted in the African experience with the tools, whether it be from African-based spirituality to thinking through African intellectuals and academics and their responses to the madness created through the project of colonization. So that's what we'll be exploring today.
Ooh, the madness created through the project of colonization and resistance and healing in that aspect is just amazing. I know that we've talked a little bit about how, slavery is not, here we go, as the Spanish, slavery is not separate from the project of colonization. And so that project of colonization as something that we do need to tell stories about, that we need to delve into the history of and all aspects of it, what the colonial project really was. And I love that we're starting in Africa to tell that story. So thank you. We have a couple of comments here. So Athena is really excited about anti-zombification strategies. We are too, Athena. And I think now it might be time to bring on our guest for today.
Awesome. I'm very excited about our guest today. Our guest is Apeike Umolu. Apeike is a historian and expert in the Black intellectual history of the 19th and 20th centuries and all aspects of Black history. She founded the African History Project, which brings together educators and writers and artists to offer educational resources for Black history. We're really excited to have her join us today.
We're so excited to have you here, Apeike. Hello.
Hello. Oh gosh, I think I've written like a page of notes just from your introduction.
Well, how are you, Apeike?
Oh, I'm doing so well. I'm so excited by this project, by this launch into history, and to have this specific conversation today, the intersection of spirituality, historical narratives, and also things that are so relevant to particularly the last 12 months, 24 months within the Black experience. I think, I just think it's going to be a wonderful, wonderful conversation we're going to have.
Oh, we're so happy to have you. I'm going to go ahead and get started with a first question for you, Apeike.
Yeah.
What is the role that African spirituality has played in creating the myth of the zombie, and particularly around resisting zombification?
And when I saw this question, spoiler alert, I got some of the questions before, but when I got this specific question, I thought it would be great to actually explain what African spirituality is, because of course, religion by its very nature, what differentiates religion from most other aspects of our life is the relationship with the spirit or with the unseen, with the immaterial. So why do we speak of African spirituality as if it's different from Christian spirituality or anything else? Well, spirituality is very central to the African religiosity. So when we talk about African spirituality, the definition requires a belief in the agency of the non-material world. It's not just a belief in the non-material world, it's a belief in the agency of the non-material world. And specifically that deities that are unseen can intervene in the world that is seen. So how can this be of comfort to people who are zombified by the racialization of society? At the most basic of levels, it reminds the oppressed that beyond the temporal world is the spiritual world. And the spiritual world is primordial and suzerain. So what we are experiencing here in the temporal world, in the corporeal world, is not the be all and end all, that there is something beyond that. And so that thing beyond has agency. And if we can be in control of that world, if we can be in relationship with that world, we can control our world here, even if we don't have relationship with or control over the material things around us. Now, the madness of colonization tells us otherwise. It tells us that how we live here today in colonization, or whether we're enslaved, this is the be all and end all. So to somebody who has a belief in African spirituality and in the agency of the unseen, this is extremely comforting, because it lets them know that there is something right now that one can have control of, that can influence their lives. This therefore allows a dislocation from the corporeal and the temporal. An entire world, an entire world can be fashioned in the mind where all the deities are African and it is they who are really in control. So if we tell the story of colonization from perhaps we might say a Western Christian perspective, then you have more advanced, technologically advanced societies that originated in Europe, came to Africa, entered into financial, economic relationships with people primarily on the west coast of Africa, but really on every coast. And in terms of the transatlantic slave trade, took tens of millions of people to the Caribbean and to the Americas. And in so doing, they were able to exert an extreme amount of force over those people, reducing them to near animal status for hundreds of years. And then after that, they were able to get their emancipation, but they continued to be oppressed in various ways. That's one telling of the story, but African spirituality would allow us to tell another story, which is that it's not just about the capture and brutalization, that actually the history of enslavement is in the disease that returns every season to take away more of the oppressor than it does of the oppressed. If you're a person that believes you can pray to deities that can bring harm to people who are oppressing you, then this is extremely comforting. And of course, much of West Africa was not colonized, and much of the Caribbean couldn't be more heavily, settled because of things like disease. So these are the ways in which African spirituality and the concept that what is unseen can affect the seen can begin to give comfort to people at the level of the mind.
Okay. So it seems like in that unseen world right there, there's that not only a space for belief in the beyond, right? If you can, it's the place where you can affect change here, right? So
Absolutely.
if you're not able to do it directly to enslavers or colonizers, but you can act in the spiritual realm.
Absolutely. And because not only can you act, the spiritual realm is you, because when somebody passes away, they don't pass away, they don't die, there is no death. They just enter into a time that is simultaneous to your own, that the consciousness of the past is simultaneous to the consciousness of the present and simultaneous to the consciousness of the future. So they are there by your side. They know what you're going through. They understand, and you can speak to them because you've spoken to them all your life. And they are the ones that are going to marshal you through the next section of your life. So not only can you control it, you can enter into conversation with them. And they, in the African spiritual world, everyone is an African. Every God is an African. There is no concept of the non-African in the African spiritual world, and in the African concepts of spirituality, all the kings are African.
Okay. Wow, that's very, very interesting.
This is amazing, and it's so powerful. And something that you said, Apeike, reminded me of the ways in which we talk about time in history. And I think that we think about historical time as linear, and perhaps that isn't what we should break that down and break that apart, right? And I wonder if you have do you have a response to that kind of zombifying force of how we think about time as linear in history, and how that's very the perspective of the colonizer. Yeah, absolutely.
I love that question, because it goes right to the heart of the philosophy of history, which is that in the African tradition, time is not linear at all. In the concept of time in the African tradition is experiential. So we obviously came later to some of the more advanced timekeeping techniques that developed elsewhere, but time really is the time of the seasons, and the seasons come every so often. It is in age groups. It is in the cycle of growth and death, and so on. So actually, in the African conception of time, time is cyclical, and you do not have the concept of progress so much as you have the concept of evolution and of change. So every time you re-experience something, it is not new. It is that you have another chance to re-experience that. So every new season, you're growing something. It is not a new iteration of this experience. It is just a continuation of the last time that you had a growing season. Now, how does that affect our conception of the past? Well, it means then that because time is cyclical in this way, it means then that all domains of time, all dimensions of time exist all the time, and you can move forward and backward within time in your consciousness. So in fact, the past can also affect the future. That's why, for example, you can consult the Orisha and the Loa, and you can ask them whether you're going to have a child, or what type of life your child is going to have. What does the future hold? Will it rain next year? Because they are in the same time as the future, if that makes sense. And the linearity of time is definitely it's an oppressive construct when you see it imposed onto African historiography. And we had this conversation about 2 weeks ago in a seminar that we held that was called Pre-Post-Colonial, and it was looking at how the division of African history into pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial affects how we engage with it. And that even the concept that there is a progressive directional movement from the pre to the colonial to the post-colonial can really distort when you're looking at African history. So yeah, absolutely. The pathology of time as being linear can often get, I think, people, or maybe the fact that isn't the case in the African experience can also be comforting in itself, because you know that another time will come again. As I live now, I will live again. As I'm experiencing this now, I will experience it again. And that can be extremely comforting.
I can imagine how it would be. I mean, it takes me back to this point of resistance here, right? And that if you're thinking through the potential of not only resistance, but thinking through liberation, right? If time is considered in a different way, then it's seemingly more optimistic, right? When you are considering time in this way. I wanted to ask you, Apeike, about the project of colonization. And we mentioned this before, this way that it can induce a madness that some scholars and intellectuals have spoken to, that the projects of colonization and slavery induce and have induced a madness that has been represented in African literature and popular culture. Can you speak a bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. The colonial madness, the madness of enslavement is the absolute aim, because it's a dehumanizing process, and it dehumanizes by taking away everything that acts or contributes to our esteem. So it takes away your name, it takes away your family, it takes away your religion, your community. It even takes away your life, or the ability of you to even dream of a tomorrow when your life is in somebody else's hands. So those are the denigrating factors that lead to the complete breakdown of esteem, the dehumanization, and of course, any human being that is subjected to that will become mad. And you see that if you lock somebody in a room with no references, they go mad. And you can almost extrapolate that to slavery or colonization at the most extreme, in the most extreme cases. Now, this is something that has interested Black scholars from the beginning of time, I would say, but particularly they've had to think about it more from when Black people had the ability to begin to reflect on enslavement in a literary way. Now, of course, these reflections existed before, and maybe we might come back to it to look at how that manifested in theology. But focusing more so on the scholars of the 19th century and into the 20th century, this was something that absolutely interested them. And one of the first scholars that I think about is Du Bois. Du Bois was really the first to give a term to this, which he called double consciousness, which I think I'm not a psychotherapist, I'm not a psychiatrist, but this idea of having two realities or having two psychologies is a form of madness. And, at its more, if we're now going to look at a pathology, it might even be a form of, multiple personality when it's taken to its very extreme. But Du Bois was not talking about that kind of manifestation of it, but he was talking about the fact that when you look at the experience of a Black person in the United States, he was talking about, they must simultaneously be themselves, but they must also be the self that has been created by the outside world, which is no self. So the African American in the 19th century in the United States was, even after emancipation, was really not a fully functioning citizen of the state. There were still so many things that were encumbering their existence. And so the society, your lived experience, is telling you you're half human. but you know you're human. So there's this kind of craziness, because when you present yourself in the world, you have to actually behave as a half human. You have to, you know, disconnect your mind, and you sit in certain places that you may not want to sit, but the law says you have to sit in those places. You go in through certain entrances that you may not want to go into, but the law says you have to. And these are the things that compound the madness, because you know you're a human, but every day you make choices, and you make decisions, I should say, more than choices, to do things that kind of compound your the notion of your inhumanity. And so for Du Bois, he was really the first thinker to give that a name, which we call, which has kind of stuck, which is the idea of double consciousness, that a lot of African American people have two psychologies going on in their mind. And the next thinker that really grapples with this and tries to find resolution is Franz Fanon in the 20th century, the Martinican political thinker. And he goes along the task of trying to map out, or trying to find a correlation between how the physical landscape, the political landscape, how that is actually a reflection of the double consciousness, or perhaps the double consciousness is just a reflection of the dichotomies that we see in society: rich, poor, valuable, not valuable. And it is to people such as Paulo Freire and Steve Biko that we begin to get actual pedagogies of reconciliation. How do you actually go about reconciling these two selves? So I would say that people such as Du Bois and Fanon went a long way to helping us map and give shape to those ideas. And then thinkers such as Paulo Freire and Steve Biko went some way to giving us actual pedagogies on how to reconcile these two selves and become whole again, and to become human again, essentially.
I feel like I've just been continually taking notes, and I'm learning so much. Apeike, thank you. We have a couple of comments that I wanted to be sure to bring in, and I think some of them have been coming across the screen as they come in too. But from Emily, we have, any being seen as other or deemed deviant by the system in power becomes a monster, and we can think about like all the connotations of monster here, right? If we'd like to, right? Who is becoming the monster? And I think this is like, who is the zombie? Who is the zombified force? It's all over it, like everyone is maybe. But then, Neil had a comment that said, so suddenly we're rooting for the zombies. And I think, in our current apocalypse, it's really hard who to know, who to root for, how to know who to root for. But I think that there's just a couple of really, nice comments here responding to what you're saying. So Fanon's writing was transformational to me, and then I do have to also bring in that we have a 9-year-old watching, and he is just really interested in what's happening, which makes us very happy. Thank you for watching. Then I'll turn it back over to Mzilikazi, who I know had a follow-up question.
Yes, it's really riveting to think about the ways in which these different scholars and thinkers are almost trying to give us a map for how to put ourselves together again, right? How do you become whole again in a world that sees you as half, right? As non-citizen, as non-human, as monster, right? As zombie. It makes me think again, Apeike, if you can highlight spaces or perhaps diasporic responses or spaces for resistance here, right? So if Fanon and Du Bois are highlighting, the madness, the two-ness and the response, and the ways in which, Biko's giving us Black consciousness, right? So then not only put ourselves together, but with confidence beyond, right? I wonder if you could speak to the ways that we see throughout the diaspora direct examples of this resistance, right? Almost a de-zombification, as it were.
Yeah, you can almost say that the Black experience in itself, by definition, is a de-zombification experience, because to even accept that you are Black in the first place, and then to try to use that as a tool of your own liberation, is one of the first steps. And the first process we often see is conscientization. And this is the process by which people begin or take the steps to understand the extent of the colonial intrigue, the extent of the madness. And this is when you begin to see the books flying off the shelves. So I would say the first resistive space is often in literature. And over the last 12 months, whether for good or for evil, we've just seen such a great explosion in interest in reading the works of the past. And in also, we've seen an interest in people giving new writers a chance as well, that are exploring these themes in new ways, whether it's new literature that's looking at identity in the contemporary sense. We've seen that. So I'll say that's one way. Another way that we also see resistance that plays out in more contemporary ways is through acts of positive psychology. Positive psychology is really, I would say, the pinnacle of it, or maybe the start of it, was with Biko's Black is Beautiful movement. And from that, you then have the reappropriation movements under Black Power. So the reappropriation of Black hair, the afro, the daishiki, all of these things were re-legitimizing processes. And they've, I think, come back alive in our day. We have organizations such as the Halo Code, which is based in the UK, I believe. And they are trying to get institutions to agree to begin to stop demonizing Black hair. And as a locked woman, of course, that means a lot to me. So we have those things that are, very kind of conscious in terms of that kind of resistance. So I would say that those are two ways in which people are fighting back in our time. We also have, of course, music. Music continues to be a way in which a lot of resistance. Firstly, the idea of music acting just as a documentation of the madness. So I would probably put hip hop right up there as a musical genre, particularly in the 80s and 1920s, what we might call conscious rap, which are basically just oral histories or oral testimonies of the Black experience. And we know the reaction and the demonization of that art form. And that is a form of resistance. But you also have it manifest also on the continent. And one of my favorite songs is actually a song called Zombie by Fela Kuti. And he's not talking about the zombification that comes from colonialism, but actually from neo-colonial military dictatorship in Nigeria. And in his song Zombie, he's talking about the soldiers who are shooting Black people. So these are Black soldiers shooting Black people. And the whole connotation of the song is, of course, that they have been zombified by the system and are no better than the colonial armies that were there before. So these are some of the ways, I think, in the more contemporary space that we see people resisting. So through a greater interest in liberation thought literature, through defending certain attacks against the Black aesthetic with things such as the reappropriation of Black hair, Black dress, and through music, through genres such as conscious rap or hip hop, and also resistance music from the continent as well.
Oh, that's very interesting. And as soon as you spoke about Fela Kuti, of course, I could hear the song in my mind. So if you haven't quite checked that out yet, I highly recommend that you listen to that. Really thoughtful points here. I wonder if we could take it, and I think you've already kind of presented the connection point here, right, through hip hop, for example, right, the connection point to contemporary culture. And I'd like to kind of keep us moving to the contemporary moment here of the anti-zombie, right? Is there an example of an anti-zombie in our contemporary moment?
Oh gosh, the anti-zombie in our contemporary moment. I'd like to take us back if possible, because I know that's the one in history.
Take us back.
And then maybe as we're going through, maybe coming more into contemporary when I can think of one. But I think the anti-zombie that comes to mind for me are the figures of the Haitian Revolution. And especially Macandal, who was the revolutionary from the middle of the 1700s, whose revolt was actually unsuccessful, but he laid the groundwork for Toussaint Louverture, Dessalines, Christophe Henri, for them to be successful a generation later. But he became sort of the anti-zombie because he was firstly a maroon. So he was somebody who chose to live outside of the system. So maybe we can actually even begin to come up with an archetype of the anti-zombie, but using Macandal as an example, he chose to live outside of the system as all Maroons did. And that was a hard life. It wasn't this idyllic life. They were often living in the most inhospitable areas of the peninsula, wherever they were, on the island or on the mainland. They were in constant hiding. They were surrounded by traps, so they basically ghettoized themselves into their own spaces because they had to set traps to make sure that people couldn't enter them. The next thing he was, in terms of being an anti-zombie, is he embraced the African religion, and in so doing, he put himself as a religious leader in his community. And as a Hugon, he was able to also get power back. He also rejected Western medicine as well. He also was a herbalist. And so that also gave him power as well in his community and influence. And he'd previously been a senior enslaved person. He'd been like one of the foremen on the plantation before. So he had escaped in his lifetime. He wasn't a second generation Maroon. So he was the anti-zombie because his reputation as a person who fought the system on so many different levels preceded him. Before anyone, would see him, the reputation of him was so big. And even after he died, 50, 60, 70 years later, he continued to be the standard of what it was to be a Haitian revolutionary. And then Dessalines probably has taken over now, since then. I think then if we think about anti-zombies now, we're probably looking at people who are willing to step outside of the economic system, because that is the biggest hold. And I think we might see aspects of anti-zombification. I don't want to name anyone because people will show the many ways they are not anti-zombie. But I think there is a conversation that is happening, particularly in the African-American community, to learn from the mistakes in particular industries from their ancestors, and that's the recent ancestors. And that is in the music industry and in the sports industry. You see a lot more people willing to take financial hits. Particularly, we've seen with people like the protest about taking the knee and things like that, on principle. People even like Monique, actually, the comedian Monique, who talked about this boycott from Netflix. So people who are willing to sacrifice their careers to say, I'm going to live outside of the economic system. I think those are examples of anti-zombiness and being awake to the depth of the control. And a lot more people speaking about multi-generational wealth or transgenerational wealth in these kind of traditional industries that have allowed African Americans to distinguish themselves. There's a lot more of an awareness to not make the same mistakes of the past in those industries. So I think if we were to use that standard, but it's not a strong standard, I think that there will be a lot of people who are demonstrating anti-zombie-like behavior, though maybe in other ways they continue to still be parts of the system, so to speak. But that would for me be the archetypal anti-zombie is in a capitalist society. It would be somebody who was willing to forego the comforts of capitalism to resist. And someone said Tyler Perry. Yeah, I think so as well. Somebody who's willing to, take the financial hit to put up the structures that perhaps he will not maybe see the full come to fruition in his lifetime. He might pass away still with investors or debt or Lord knows what, but he's building for generations to come. So that's what I would say.
Wow, excellent points. I'm really just like captured by your examples here, particularly the way you've grounded in the historical anti-zombie, right? The Maroon. And so often when we're thinking this kind of blanket read of the culture, like you've been made into a zombie or not, except that they're throughout these examples of resistance, of Maroonage, of rebellion, of fighting back and resisting, whether it be small points of worker stoppage to escaping, right? Yeah. To communities of Maroons, right?
Yeah, even in the most, if anyone hasn't read CLR James's The Black Jacobins, please go and get it. And also M.S. Césaire's Notebook of a Return to the Native Land. Both of them are quite dense, actually, but very, very good books. But we see in CLR James's account, he talks about things such as abortions. That enslaved women would give themselves abortions by drinking all sorts of very dangerous substances. Or there was this thing they used to do where they used to sew the mouths of their children together, but not that they used to sew them. They used to, I think, break a ligament that would prevent the mouth from opening, and their young children would die of starvation. And or poisoning as well, slowly poisoning your the plantation owner. So these are some of the acts of resistance that, they're not documented, but it's through oral histories that they have been, or oral traditions that they have been passed down from generation to generation. And we see that the entire enterprise of enslavement and colonialism was an act of resistance. And in many ways, if you think about it, 400 years and the colonial forces were not able to dehumanize the African American or the Jamaican, though they tried. And, in some cases, 80 years, 60 years, they were not able to dehumanize the African on the continent either. So it was a complete failure. And now what we're going to see, perhaps in the next 400 to 500 years, I hope it doesn't take that long, is going to be the repair of what has happened on the mind. And hopefully that would manifest in the rebuilding of our political and economic structures as well.
I am jumping in because we're running out of time, but I just, there's this question that we have in comments that Athena has asked that I think is building on what you've just said, Apeike, which is, how can we harness the forces of zombification for good, right? Because we can't always avoid zombification, or we want to totally avoid it. And I think that this is very related to what you said, that like every revolution is an act of resistance to zombification, but it also in a way organizes us in some way. So I wonder if you have any responses to that or any final thoughts for us today. I'm learning so much.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that at its heart, if we look at the archetypal zombie, it is somebody who is either so not preoccupied by the system. So you could look at it like that they are actually no longer being controlled by the system. They are numb to it. They're moving through it. Cars are moving past. I'm talking about like the zombies of movies. Cars are going past them and they're completely numb to the system. And to a certain extent, if you are somebody who wants to go through a process of psychological decolonization, you have to turn off the system. You have to become numb to certain narratives in the news, certain graphics that you see, certain conversations that are had, certain ways of being in space and with each other. You have to no longer allow yourself and your emotions to be moved by those things, because you have to understand that the system itself is dysfunctional and it's not working. So that's a way you can use zombification to your benefit. And the other way is that if you look at another type of zombification, I'm trying to think of all my zombie movies that I've watched like 28 days later. In that type of zombification, there's like an obsession with something, obsession to get that person, or there's always something that's triggering the zombie, whether they're attracted to light or to noise or to something. So that sort of obsession about trying to get at what you want, you can almost get yourself into a zombie-like state if you really say to yourself that I will no longer be psychologically colonized, and so I'm going to do nothing but work towards, in everything that I do, making sure that I am an agent of psychological decolonization, and that can become a zombified state, which I think it probably is for all of us on this conversation to an extent.
Absolutely. And I think that that's so powerful as an ending thought. I refuse to be psychologically zombified and colonized. And I just want to just extend such gratitude to you for joining us today, Apeike. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been absolutely wonderful. Thank you for the brilliant questions. It's just been great. Got me thinking, and for everybody's comments as well. It's just been a wonderful experience.
Well, it's wonderful to have you. I want to thank everyone for joining us, and we will see you next month. And until then, don't be a zombie. Know your history. Take care.
I know it's crazy, but it seems so logical. I can't deny that there is something supernatural with you.